So, welcome everyone to our getting close to the end of our Wisteria Hearst Presents presentations. We're winding up our last presentations and performances under this Community Development Block Grant, and we are grateful to all of you who have participated and showed up over the past year and a half. To recap, we've hosted 24 of these online programs, and I don't have an exact count yet, but over 300. Brianne seems to think it's significantly more, but over 300 people have attended these presentations. And our reach has been global. We've had attendees from California, Mexico, Puerto Rico, France, Chicago, Ireland, and many other states. So who knew? The grant was to target seniors in Holyoke, and here we are. We have a new audience that's worldwide. My name is Penny Martorell, and I'm the curator at Wisteria Hearst and these online presentations. This thanks to our funder, the Community Development Block Grant, as administered through the Holyoke Department of Community Development, and thanks to our collaborator, the Holyoke Council on Aging, who have helped us promote these programs. Our last event on our calendar for the year is tomorrow night, an online concert from a local young singer-songwriter, Lexi Weege, who comes highly recommended. And I hope that you can join us and celebrate the closing of this year. And just a little shout out to our director, Wisteria Hearst director, Megan Seiler. She's providing tech support for tonight's event. Megan, do you want to say hi?
Hi, I know I'm a new face, so I look forward to hopefully seeing you all in person sometime soon. And thanks for joining us tonight.
So, just a few Zoom basics. We ask that you keep yourself muted, the little microphone in the lower left hand corner of your screen, throughout the program and until the question and answer, and then we'll kind of free form it there. You can pop in. Once our speaker begins her presentation, we will mute anybody who is unmuted. And Megan and I will be monitoring the chat, and which is the speaker bubble down at the center of your screen at the bottom of your Zoom window. So you can submit your questions in there, or again, we'll open it up after Brianna's finished presenting. And the session is being recorded and will be posted for a few weeks on our Wisteria Hearst YouTube channel. Before we get started, we need to collect some information. So Megan will launch the poll to gather the information required for our funder. Thank you for participating in that. There we go. So there's just 4 questions. You might have to scroll down. If you could give those answers to us, though it's totally anonymous. It cannot be, connected with anything. So it just helps us give numbers back to our funder to say that we actually produced something of meaningful value and that people were here and attended. So we appreciate that. Oh, give it a couple more seconds. We got about 83% participation, 87% participation.
Great.
All right. 91. All right. 91%. Woohoo. Great. Thank you very much for sharing that information with us, and our funders will be happy to know that we actually did something. So, Brianne Zulkiewicz is the education manager at Amelia Park Children's Museum, where she designs literacy, art, and science programming. A former Wisteria Hearst staff member, Zulkiewicz keeps up with the latest in local history by serving as an associate board member for the Pioneer Valley History Network. She's currently pursuing a master's in public history at Central Connecticut State University. Brianne.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me back. I haven't left very long ago, so some of you are very familiar faces, and I really thank you for joining me tonight for this program. I I think I'm kind of ready to get started. I'm excited to talk about one of my passions, architecture. And we're specifically going to be talking a lot about local architecture. And I'm just going to start my presentation. So, all right. And there we go. Can you all see that?
Yes, we
Great.
can.
So today's presentation is called Understanding the Architecture of Your Town. It's a virtual crash course in local architectural history research. This is designed primarily for folks who don't have a background in architectural history, but if you do, like me, hopefully you'll get something out of it as well. If you are interested in some of the buildings that you see in your town, or if you are a Holyoke resident, hopefully this will be of interest to you. All right, so what's my background? Why am I qualified to talk about this with you today? I worked at Wisteria Hearst for 5.5 years. I'm very familiar with Holyoke's history and architecture. I'm currently a graduate student at Central Connecticut State University, where my academic research focuses on housing in Northern Connecticut, primarily after 1850. And I love old houses. I'm currently restoring an old house with my mother. All right, so if you're like me, a little bit overwhelmed sometimes when you think about starting architectural history research, this kind of guides the question of where to start. Here are the three approaches that you can undertake when you're doing architectural history research. There's probably others. These are the three that I'm highlighting for us today. You can identify properties associated with important events, trends, or time periods in your town's history. You can select a particular structure and research its history directly, or you can familiarize yourself with common architectural styles and attempt to locate them in your own town. If we're going to start with the understanding history approach, every city and town has a built environment that is unique to their own economic, political, cultural, and social circumstances. Often, one of the best places to start investigating architectural history is researching important events in your neighborhood's past. So if you know that there was a battle that happened in your town, or someone famous came there, or there was an industry that was really prominent in your town, those are all important things to consider, and to think about how those events and circumstances shaped the houses and structures and buildings in your town. If we're talking about Holyoke specifically, how does Holyoke's architecture reflect its historic past? I just brainstormed this a little bit, and here are some of the themes that I came up with. Holyoke was once very prosperous, but has faced tough times due to deindustrialization. Holyoke once had a concentration of industrial manufacturing, with many residents working in the sector. Arson, neglect, and urban renewal led to the destruction of many of Holyoke's historic structures. Holyoke has a strong legacy of immigration and migration. Holyoke currently is rapidly turning towards marijuana production. And so you can kind of think about these same sort of themes in your town. If you're not from Holyoke, what are the prominent stories that happened in your town? What are the important events that occurred? What are the industries? What are the things that are affecting the lives of residents in that town, past and present? To expand on the industrial legacy, let's explore how this specifically shaped the way that Holyoke's architecture looked. So you can see examples of Holyoke's industrial past. Ooh, one of my photos is not loading. In some buildings here in town, you can see that there are row houses that were constructed for factory workers. This one here on the right is actually historically landmarked, or it's listed on the state register. I'm not really sure which one. It's considered fairly significant because it was considered a very nice example of housing for factory workers, considered much nicer than some of the other housing that was built in the same time period. In the middle, you can see Wisteria Hearst. as an example of where the mill owners and the industrial capitalists lived. And on the left, where if my image had loaded, you could see an example of factories, mills, and commercial spaces. So the factories themselves. Okay, next topic is immigration and migration. How has this historical narrative shaped Holyoke's architecture? That was one of the other 5 themes that I came up with to talk to you a little bit about. All right, so here are 3 categories of buildings associated with this theme. So first we have cultural centers, which are structures that are associated with a particular ethnic or cultural group. On this one, I have the Turn Hall, which is the German Athletic Association building. So this is basically a gymnasium that was built for folks who belong to this social club, and turn halls are common in German areas across the US. In the middle, churches. This is Mater della Rosa, which was a Polish church here in Holyoke that was unfortunately demolished just a couple years ago. And churches are almost always just one religious group, but often they represent a particular ethnic community. And then on the far right, we have storefronts. So shops, markets, or other commercial ventures that are associated with a migrant or immigrant group. So this one is actually a really interesting example. It's currently Nueva Esperanza, which is a Puerto Rican organization, but they adaptively reused this building. Before it was Nueva, it was Heinrich's Drugs, and it was founded in, I believe, the 1890s, and it was that same building I think just up until Nueva moved in. I'm not quite sure of that. So it was like a German drugstore that was served the German community, because I know that neighborhood had a lot of German immigrants in it. And now it serves Puerto Rican migrants who live in that neighborhood. All right. My second approach is the individual structure approach. Every building is a product of a society that, for whatever reason, necessitated its construction. Sometimes you already know the building you're trying to research, and you need to learn more about the historic environment that led to its production. Nobody just builds a building for no reason. There's always a consumer need, a capitalist need, a residential need to have that building built. In Holyoke, some of the notable structures that you think of when you're doing an architectural history based on significant buildings are unique structures that aren't found elsewhere. Public buildings, including City Hall, the library, and the post office. These are examples that you'd find in most towns. Schools, including public, private, and parochial. Buildings that people hope to restore or renovate, those are often the top in the forefront of people's minds. And buildings that have been demolished, things that were particularly architecturally significant that unfortunately for whatever reason no longer exist here in the city. And you can brainstorm these sort of lists for your own town if you don't live in Holyoke, and come up with some notable buildings and work from there. So based on this, what are some buildings in Holyoke? I'm not sure why my images are not loading. I'm so sorry about that. But on the left, I had Holyoke City Hall, which was individually listed on the National Register of Historic Places. On the right, I have the old Holyoke train station, which was designed by a famous architect. That was H.H. Richardson. He is from Massachusetts, I believe. And this style of architecture that's associated with him is called Richardsonian Romanesque. And you can see it has lots of arches. It has the two-tone stone, the different color stone. And this is a fairly prominent example. He did a lot of train stations. He did libraries and a lot of municipal buildings. All right, additional buildings that you see in Holyoke include Holyoke Community College. Holyoke Community College was the state's first community college, and it was opened after the GI Bill was passed to serve residents of the local area. Then also the Holyoke Mall. The Holyoke Mall is one of New England's largest shopping malls. It was built in the late 1970s during sort of a high point in mall building. It's, of course, being one of New England's largest shopping malls, pretty big. So these are two structures, I guess, that you wouldn't think of necessarily when you're thinking about architecture. I think people tend to associate architectural history with single family homes and buildings like City Hall or the train station. But as somebody who does this sort of work, I'm really interested in a lot of the buildings that are not necessarily as examined. So more contemporary buildings, or buildings that are just, not seen as prominent in the community, but I do think that they're quite interesting as well. All right, and then next we have three more that are associated with Holyoke. So on the left, we have the merry-go-round. This building itself is not particularly architecturally significant. It is a newer building, but inside of the building is a historic carousel. So it's significant in that the structure was built to house another structure that people wanted to preserve. So it's sort of an interesting thing, and it is also pretty unique to Holyoke. I don't know any of the other towns in the area that have their own carousel. So this one, it makes it onto my list. In the middle is Churchill Homes. This is a development of the Holyoke Housing Authority. It's a public housing development. And it was built as part of a national effort to deconcentrate poverty in public housing. Before it was Churchill Homes, it was, oh my gosh, it was Jackson Parkway, I believe. Somebody who remembers can probably correct me later. But it was a more high density public housing development. And there was sort of a national movement where people were concerned about crime and drug use in public housing, and wanted to move towards single family homes and smaller, lower density apartment complexes. That was called Hope 6, I believe. And this was built as part of that nationwide program. And then on the left, or on the right, we have the Holyoke Opera House. That was very prominent. It was across the street from City Hall. And unfortunately, it was destroyed by fire in 1967. But it is one of those structures that people often think of when they think about Holyoke's lost architectural heritage. So those are also important to consider, and to expand upon from there. So these are some examples of things that you might find a building and want to work specifically based on its architectural history. All right, and my third approach is called the architectural styles approach. I argue that buildings reflect the tastes, styles, aesthetics, and period that they were built in. This isn't a surprise to anyone. Typically, houses reflect the style of the year they were built in, and when they don't, it's usually a revival, or there's some reason for it to be built in a previous style, or maybe it is just the beginning of a new style. So sometimes you're interested in a particular architectural style and you want to see what examples of it exist near you. This is pretty common. There's a lot of people who are fans of Victorian era architecture. There's a lot of people who are fans of the arts and crafts movement, and they are working to document what examples of those structures exist locally, wherever they happen to be. So I do have some examples of this. in Holyoke. The English colonial architectural style, federal and Georgian, are both unique styles within this, exists here in Holyoke. You can see from the diagrams on the left side, they're fairly similar. They're characterized by having 5 windows on the front of the house on the top floor and 4 on the bottom with the door in the center. And they have a side gable and chimney or chimneys. On the right, you can see examples of this here in Holyoke. Sorry to anybody who might live in any of these houses. I don't mean to put you on the spot. I just picked some examples that I saw in town. So hopefully none of you are feeling put on the spot. But on 540 Homestead Ave, here's an example that was built in around 1770. You can see that it has a porch that was added to it. And I think that this is something that we kind of have to point out. There are very few houses that are perfect examples of their architectural style. Most houses have been changed or added onto at some point, especially when they're 300 years old. And sometimes builders just change the trend a little bit when they're building. If everything were a textbook example, it would be a lot easier, but that of course is not the case. So you need to learn to be a little bit of a detective when you're doing architectural history research, see what could be a later modification. And these look clapboard. The top one might be vinyl, I can't remember. But yeah, so sometimes you'll see a house that's vinyl sided and that makes you think maybe it's newer, but in fact, it could just be vinyl that's added over much older wood clapboard. So on the right, on the top right, we have 1329 Northampton Street, which is circa 1780. This house has like a little addition on the left side. I think this is the house that has been under construction for a while. But that's a pretty good example of the 5 windows on the top and 4 on the bottom. They're very evenly spaced. The 540 Homestead Ave, they're a little bit offset. 467 Rock Valley Road on the bottom is from 1780. That is missing its top upper window. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes people put a bathroom in or change the stairs a little and they remove one of the windows. So it doesn't look exactly like the diagram, but you can kind of tell that that's what it's supposed to be. And this one has a side addition, which is almost certainly later. And then 100 Mountain Road on the right has a porch, which again is probably also a later addition. And that one you can see it has a little attic window as well. All right, and our next style is the French Second Empire. You can see the little diagram there. This one is pretty famous because there's one sort of thing that always gives it away. It has that special roof line. You all know Wisteria-Hearst. Wisteria-Hearst, the older section of Wisteria-Hearst is built in this style, the Second Empire style. It has that roof, which is called a mansard roof. That means the 3rd floor, or sometimes the 2nd floor, is actually a full story, not an attic, but it has a roof line that extends on the whole height of that story. So you can see the top left, I cannot read the address because I put it too high, is built in 1870, and you can see it has that sort of curved mansard roof with some ornate ornamentation on it. 126 Beach Street is a duplex that's right down the street from Wisteria-Hearst. Couldn't get a better shot that wasn't blocked by trees. This one's just from Google's Maps, but that also has a mansard roof. 1 Canal Street, I believe this is owned by the Holyoke Gas and Electric, also has the distinctive roof line, and it has some pretty ornate dormer windows up there as well, with some beautiful curves, and 185 High Street, which is a commercial example. This one is 4 stories rather than 3. This building is called the Caledonian, and it has that pretty little tower in the middle as well. And you can tell, you probably can't read on your computer screen, but this style was popular between 1855 and 1885. So if you find a house and it was built between those years and you think maybe it's this style, there's a good chance. All right, our next style is Queen Anne. So a lot of people kind of loosely call this Victorian style, but it's actually a distinct style within the Victorian period. It was common between 1880 and 1910. Here are some examples in Holyoke. Again, I put the address of the one on the top left up too high, but that is, I believe, Jay's Bed and Breakfast now. So that one's from 1883. That one is brick. And Queen Anne, you can often recognize because there's a lot of towers and turrets and curves. There's often a porch, there's often an overhang over the front door, there's ornamentation, there's multiple different roof lines going on. The one on Appleton Street on the top right has a beautiful curved tower that you can see, a wraparound porch, a porch on the 2nd floor, and it even looks like a little balcony on the 3rd floor. On the bottom, 26 Fairfield Avenue is a slightly smaller example with front gabling, but it has 2 separate roof lines and it has a porch on the 1st and the 2nd floor. And likely, I cannot remember, I saw an example of this because this one was built by a local architect, George P.B. Alderman. Penny will correct me because I know that I messed that up. But this one likely had an open porch on the 2nd floor. And then 284 Essex Street, which is another large example. This one looks like it either had its side porch enclosed or it has a little side addition. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but in this sort of area. All right, and then I think I have one last style for you. Yep, this is the Craftsman. This is popular. There's not as many of these here as there are other places, but there are still quite a few because the time period this was popular, 1905 to 1930, was a time of a lot of prominence in Holyoke, and often most building occurs when a town is going through financial successes. So if you're having a hard time, if there's a recession or a depression, you're likely not going to build very many houses. So this one, the diagram shows a front gable, 2 distinct roof lines that face the street, but there are also, it can have the side gable like the one on the top left with the porch. This is a very traditional style. You see this a lot in California. This is very popular in the Los Angeles area. It has the sort of wide columns. This is also really popular as a revival style, not so much around here, but a lot of people are building houses now that sort of emulate this design. The one on Dartmouth Street looks almost exactly like the diagram, but it has a porch on the opposite side. That's from 1925. And then 32 Claremont Avenue, it was built in 1913. You can't really see it, but that one also has stone, like the one on the top left, as columns on its porch, and it has a front gable as well. And then 29 Francis Avenue was built in 1921. This one I thought was kind of interesting because it has the garage kind of nested under the house, which is a little bit unique. And it looks like it kind of has like maybe a raised basement or something. I'm not sure. But this style of house is usually 1.5 stories, they call it. So it has a second story, but is either not full height or has like reduced ceiling height compared to the first floor. Can be a little bit taller, and it's strongly associated with like the arts and crafts movement. It's like a sub genre of the arts and crafts movement, but we're getting into the weeds here. All right. I just gave you a ton of information. So I think I might have overwhelmed you a little bit, but don't worry. We're going to go through how you can get this sort of information for yourself, what sort of resources you should consult, and so on. All right, so first you should definitely start at your local library. Most towns maintain a collection of historical documents and materials, and sometimes they're only open by appointment, so please call ahead. This is the Holyoke Public Library Holyoke History Room. I just screenshotted their hours for you, and they usually have collections. They usually have things like city directories. They might have old newspapers. You might have to learn how to use microfilm, which I never learned how to use.
So that's her.
All right, then the second one is public records. This is the one that I'm really good at, and it creeps my friends out a little bit, but it's all out there on the internet. For Holyoke, you can view property records here. It's one of these two links. The first one is GIS style, which is like the map at the bottom, so you can kind of like click on places on the map and find info. And the second one is the data card style. It's the top one. My images are reversed, of course. For other towns, you can find these databases by searching your town's name plus assessor GIS or your town plus property cards. And your town's website may also have this linked in its assessor section. So this is a great place to look. You can put in the owner's name or the address or the year built, and you can find info. If you look up your own house by your last name, you can find out what year it was built, how many bedrooms it thinks that you have, the size of the lot. You can also find previous owners of the house using these websites. And that's pretty interesting if you're trying to track down old photos of the house, or you have a theory about someone prominent who lived there or something of that nature. If you're a resident like me of Hampden County, you can find more information at hamdendeeds.com. And if you live in a different county, you can put your county's name in Register of Deeds and search, and those will also have information on who owns it. It will have information on the lot and things of that nature. It will have less architectural history related stuff, but it will have all of the official data. I do not always trust the year built information from this, but it does give you a starting point. For example, my house is listed as a year that's about 8 years off from when it was actually built, but it's in the general vicinity. All right, so this is a really great Massachusetts specific resource. I call it MACRIS. I don't know if that's actually how the people who work there pronounce it, but it's the database of the Massachusetts Historical Commission. You can visit it. The address is on the screen there, and you can view individual property records, historic inventory reports, state and national register of historic places forms. It takes a little bit of getting used to navigate the website, but it's very comprehensive. I used it today to track down for this program today to track down some of the properties. If you live not in Massachusetts, you can find these records through your own state's historic commission or your state's historic preservation office. And that photo on the top left there on the screenshot, I believe, is in Northampton. All right. Digital Commonwealth is another great resource here in Massachusetts. It's a digital repository of historical materials submitted by local organizations. If you are outside of Massachusetts, your state may have a similar website. Sometimes they're maintained by local universities. If you search your state's name and digital collections, it should point you in the right direction. And this one has maps, postcards, photographs. I don't recommend putting like your address in, but if you put in Holyoke or Westfield or Chicopee or whatever into the search bar, you can see what they have and see if you can find some useful information. All right, and then books. I took a lot of the little diagrams from this presentation from my personal favorite book for architectural history research, Virginia McAllister's A Field Guide to American Houses, the definitive guide to identifying and understanding America's domestic architecture. I'm not getting any money for recommending this to you, but I do recommend that you buy this book if you are at all interested in architectural history research. It is very comprehensive. This little diagram here on the right is an example of one of the ways that she helps you navigate through architectural history research. So if you see a roof that looks like a hipped pyramid, she suggests different styles that it could be. And then you can go to that style section and see different characteristics that make up that style and see whether that's a good fit. Again, like I'm saying, it's more of an art than a science. So you do have to learn to interpret the results. Sometimes when you go to things, even MACRIS, which is often compiled by historic preservation professionals, there is disagreement, particularly between styles where there's a lot of overlap, such as Colonial Revival and Free Classic Queen Anne, which are two styles that are very similar. Interpreting which one it is a little bit of an art. Other places that you can look are city directories. I mentioned these briefly. These are basically like pre-phone book phone books, but they have a lot more information. The Library of Congress is really great. They have these maps called Sanford Fire Insurance Maps, which will have a lot of information about usually the more urban neighborhoods or the more industrial neighborhoods. Your local historical society, if your town has one. Check with your neighbors, see if they have any information. Check old newspapers, which might be available at your local library. Check architectural plans, especially if you can find out who the architect is of the particular building you're looking for. And also ancestry and family search. Never eliminate these as options. When I was researching my own house, I found the first owner of it, and I was able to find out some info about him and his life here from these websites. And sometimes people upload photos there as well. All right, so if you have questions, you can connect with me. Here's my email address. But I'm gonna go back to I'm gonna stop sharing and we can have some questions. All right.
So Brianne, one question came up. Was 540 Homestead Avenue the home of Bushman Fuller family?
That sounds very familiar. I don't actually have it written down. Let me just, do you know? Do you know?
I know that they had a house on, oh, yeah, Mary's a neighbor there, so maybe she knows a little bit.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that one specifically.
Yes, it was Bushman Fuller's home.
Yeah.
And it's significant in New England history in that he was an African-American man who had purchased his own freedom, and he also managed to purchase his wife's freedom.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you for sharing that, Mary. That is so important to know. And I wish that I had known that before I included it on my presentation.
Does anyone else have any questions? You can either put it in the chat or raise your hand and we'll try to get to you. I have another question for you, Brianne.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you know some of besides Richardson, do you know some of the other architects or builders or names that go along with buildings?
Yeah. So I mentioned briefly George Alderman, who has middle initials that I keep forgetting. And he is a very significant architect in Holyoke's history. He built a lot of primarily public buildings, Holyoke and in surrounding towns. And people are very fond of him. So he's a fairly significant architect here in Holyoke. We have a hand from Joan.
The middle initials are BP. George
Thank you.
BP Alderman.
Great. I kept messing that up. I'm so sorry. Sorry to Mr.
No
Alderman.
need for an apology.
But yes, I'm not an expert in him specifically, but I know there are quite a few people who do study his work. I actually focus a lot more in my own research on Connecticut's historic houses and structure. So I have been doing a lot of research on actually public housing in Connecticut. So that is what I know more about. I know most of this just from working here in Holyoke. Somebody asked what the name of the book I mentioned was. It is The Field Guide to American Architecture, or A Field Guide. It should be pretty easy to find. It's considered pretty important within architecture history, but it is very readable and there's lots of pictures.
Mary, you have another question?
Yeah, I used to live at 27 Roosevelt Ave, and that was a bungalow. It was a perfect example of a craftsman style house. And you know, I don't know if it's true, but we were told that the house came on the back of a truck. It was a mail order home from Sears, and it was a Sears Craftsman home. And that's, and so do you know anything about that? I thought that's why they called them, or it got the tag Craftsman homes.
So, okay. So I actually do know a lot about this. This is one of my niche favorite topics. So Sears did produce mail order houses. There are a couple other companies that also produce mail order houses. You could get them and they would send you all the wood pre-cut and then have your friends and family help you assemble them. A lot of things get lumped into the category of Sears houses that were from these other companies because there were quite a few of them. So it's possible that it was one of these other companies or from Sears. But if there's a reason you think it was a mail order house, there's a possibility. All of these floor plans and architectural plans are digitized. So you should be able to find that. I'm happy to help you take a look. The name Craftsman reflects the arts and crafts movement, of which Craftsman is a part rather than Craftsman Tools, which is like the Sears associated company. But I don't know, did you know the number you said of Roosevelt Ave?
27.
27. I'd have to take a look. I don't know of any known Sears houses that are documented to be in Holyoke. I know there's one in Chicopee that recently went for sale. It was on Keith in Chicopee, and there's one in Hadley on Route 47. But specifically in Holyoke, I'm not sure. I'd have to take a look. But it's possible that it is by Sears and it's just not on the databases yet.
I know there's
Thank
another
you.
craftsman. There's another craftsman house on Riverview Terrace. That's it just went on the market a few months ago, and I was dying to get in there. It looked like a gorgeous house. There's a couple other questions. How is your research presented? Have you presented anywhere else or plan on?
Sure. So my research on public housing in Connecticut is actually a report that I'm issuing to the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office. I'm focusing on public housing developed after 1940 in Connecticut. And I talk a lot about modernism in that report. I assume it will be available to researchers in Connecticut at some point if you're interested in that. It's a little bit, I think it's really interesting, but I think it's a little bit more dense than this, but I'm happy. I would love to present specifically about public housing in the future if folks are interested. I do think it's a very under-examined topic. People have not really talked about the architecture of public housing very much. But yeah, so it's going to be an academic paper. So, I mean, if you are interested, I did put my email address up, which is my first initial last name at Gmail. So you are welcome to email me and I will send you a copy of my academic research.
And then there's another question from Roxanne. Are you familiar with Alice Washburn's homes in Connecticut? In Hamden, New Haven, Woodbridge area. Her story is very interesting.
I am not, but that name sounds vaguely familiar. So I actually, I'm not positive, but I would love to read more about this. I do remember hearing something about a female architect working in Connecticut in that area who did like sort of middle class housing, but I'm not sure if this is the same architect. So I would not be the person to ask. One of my classmates at school was doing that research. But if you know more, please feel free to email me. I'd love to read about it.
Then Marie says there's a craftsman house on Woodbridge Street in South Hadley.
Oh, cool.
And Mary Thayer says, can you be more specific as to the location of the Sears mail order house in Hadley?
Yeah, so it's I will try. So if you are driving north on Route 47 in Hadley and you drive past Skinner State Park and you drive past that sign that tells you like the flood levels and you drive past the marina, on the left, it's like maybe 8 houses in past the marina on the left. That's as specific as I can be. I think it's yellow.
Does anyone have any other questions? Roxanne said that she started building in midlife, so I think she's referring to Woodman.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's cool. I'll have to take a look. I just popped the name into my notes to read about later. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah.
I love Sears kit houses. Please, if anybody, seems like there's a lot of interest in them. So I'm happy to talk about those with folks as well. I know the one in Chicopee just sold like a couple years ago. I kind of like fantasized about buying it briefly. But yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon that's like almost completely forgotten today, that people bought their houses and built them.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at the patterns of building in terms of the size of houses.
Yeah.
So there are big farmhouses, big family farmhouses, and then post World War II, especially in Chicopee, there are all these base houses, the quick GI houses that were put up that are smaller houses, and now we're back to these big giant houses.
Yeah, I do think that's really interesting. And I know that, a lot of folks lived in apartments when these big houses were built. So it's not like everyone lived in a giant house. I think that often gets forgotten too. Everyone assumed that during the time of these Queen Anne houses that everyone lived in these 4,500 square foot houses. It's just not true. It was the wealthy folks. A lot of folks lived in pretty squalid conditions in tenements and things like that.
Joan Steiger says you didn't mention Dutch colonial style. Can you have anything to say about that?
Sure. So the Dutch colonial style, like the English colonial styles, dates back to the time that the Dutch were colonizing the US. In its non-revival form, it didn't really extend into our area. It mostly stayed in the New York border. Our area was colonized by the English, and the Dutch didn't really make it to this area. As a revival style, it did happen here. We do have Dutch colonial revival, but we don't have the original Dutch colonial. It looks fairly similar to the English colonial style, but the sort of way that it's distinct is the roof line, which you guys will all recognize. It has the two different like pitches, so it's like steeper and then shallower at the bottom. But yeah, that's another popular style of the colonial era.
Anyone else? Any more questions? Are you ready to get out there and start, looking at your neighborhood and
Yeah.
tracking down the
Please feel free to send me an email if you have a house that you're kind of on the fence about what architectural style it is, or you need help finding some more history. But again, I do recommend picking one of those methods. Either start with the house, start with the history, or start with the architectural style, and pick which one of those strategies works best for you, and go from there. And I know that because all of you are here, you're probably already pretty familiar with the base level history. So maybe pick one of those other methods. Oh, I do have another question. What about Italianate? Yes, that's another popular style in the area. I didn't have time to go into all the popular architectural styles in the area, but we do have quite a bit of Italianate around here as well. That typically has like a more flat roof. It also has ornamentation around the roof line the same way that the Second Empire does.
Oh, that just reminded me, the house that you pointed out on Beach Street.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we actually, at Wisteria Hearst, we actually have the toolbox of the builder of that house.
Oh,
Yeah.
how
So
fun.
yeah, it's kind of just tucked away in the middle of a bunch of houses there, and somebody donated it, and it had the address, and yeah, it's kind of cool. So don't forget to check out your museums too. That might local history
Yeah.
collections might have information about older buildings in your community.
Absolutely. And I thank Mary for providing me that info about that house on Homestead Ave. What an important addition to the narrative of the architectural history of that house.
We have our archives that are open to the public, so you can always email Penny and say, hey, I'm doing this research, and we might have some really great resources here for you. That would be great.
Yeah, I did not mention Penny in my presentation because I didn't want to give her more work to do, but you should. She knows a lot of stuff.
That's fun work, though.
It is. It
Some
is.
research like that, not pushing papers.
It is. And I do encourage everyone to just like appreciate the mystery, because sometimes it gets frustrating. You're not going to find answers right away unless your house was built 2 weeks ago. It's going to take a while. You're going to have to do some guesswork. You're going to have to follow some leads. It's like being a private investigator, but there's no crime. There's just a building.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you, Brianne. This was really insightful, and I think we all had a good time listening and learning. Thank you, everyone, for showing up again. And don't forget tomorrow night's free concert. You can still register, and I'll be sending out the link tomorrow. So have a good evening, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you. And
Thank you,
Brianne.
everyone.
Bye-bye.